Good afternoon, all. Great to see so many people online. I know people are still coming on in there, but I think I might look to get started. Great to see many familiar faces or familiar names, at least online this afternoon as well. And for those that I haven't met before, my name's Mark Roberts. I'm CASA's Chief Risk Officer. And we want to take an opportunity today to present to industry some work that we've recently done. Originally, it was done in response to some queries from our board here at CASA, and it was looking at the longer term safety trends, and by longer term, it's looking around 10 years, and you can see on the screen there, we've looked from 2014 through to present. We've also run this presentation internally for staff in the last couple of weeks within CASA, and we're very keen to share it from an industry perspective as well. So I know we might have people from all different aspects. The initial scope I know I gave to the comms team was around the best audience for this is probably people in the safety management space, people that are involved in data analytics with their own airlines, or I guess anyone that's involved in the industry that's interested to see and learn more. So welcome everyone, and thank you very much. Just as a bit of a heads up, I will let everyone know that this meeting is being recorded, and it will be loaded up through our website onto the YouTube channel afterwards. So if people miss something or need to come back and have a look at another point that I've made, again, just feel free to have a look at that afterwards. But it is being recorded. I'm also happy to take questions as we go. I know we do have quite a large audience today. There was quite a couple of hundred people that are registered, which is really great to see. If there are questions, I'm happy to field them as we go. If people want to jump in, they're welcome to do that. I may not notice your hand straight away. Feel free to jump in if you've got a question. Alternatively, you can type one in the chat as well, and we can look to get to those at the end, time permitting. I am going to try and get through this in around 45 minutes to leave those sort of last 15 minutes or so for any questions from the group in that regard. Noting that I still do have people streaming in, I am going to get started though. Just as a bit of a preamble, I guess CASA does routine industry safety performance monitoring. We do that through what's called our Aviation Safety Scorecard, and I guess that typically looks at a fairly short time window, and it looks at industry safety performance in the preceding quarter or so, usually when we're doing that reporting. This particular bit of work is looking at the longer term trends, so it's looking how we're performing over a 10-year period. So again, it's just designed to contrast the short-term performance that we're seeing with how we're actually performing from a long-term perspective. I will give a bit of a call out here. The data in here is valid through to the end of September. So obviously now November, there's a few things that will have changed, certainly the 24 rates and numbers, but certainly that they were valid through to the end of September. The other thing I'll call out, and you'll probably see it as we go through, where we look at rates, where you're relying on movement data there that comes from BITRA, and those at the time of publishing this, those were valid and available through to the end of 2022, which is why you see our 2023 and 24 numbers will be estimated values, and you'll see that as I'll call it out as we go through as well. In terms of broader data sources, CASA has a standing data sharing arrangement with the ATSB, where de-identified safety occurrence data is shared with CASA, as it is actually shared publicly through the ATSB's Power BI interface, and we rely on that from an occurrence perspective for our main source of data. As I mentioned, we use BITRA when it comes to aircraft movements and flight hours, and then we have our own CASA data as well with regards to things like aircraft registers and a few other sources. So before I dive in, I guess, to the safety performance aspect, I'm keen to give a bit of context in terms of the industry as a whole within Australia, and I guess this is particularly pertinent when we start looking at some of the fatal accidents and accident numbers, just to understand sometimes why we're seeing what we're seeing. So from an Australian perspective, we have around 16,500 registered, that's VH registered aircraft within Australia. Around 12,000 airplanes, 2,700 helicopters, just under 500 balloons, and just under 1,000 gliders. Now, one caveat I will call out with our aircraft registered data is we often find that the registers, people don't necessarily keep their registrations up to date when aircraft are parked in sheds or or no longer in use. Sometimes CASA is not necessarily notified of that. So the actual number of active aircraft in the country may actually differ from that, but as it stands, this is sort of our best source of data when it comes to registered aircraft. We start breaking that down then and having a look at, well, what does that actually consist of? Around 73% of the registered aircraft in Australia are airplanes, around 16% helicopters, just under 6% gliders, and then down the rest into balloons and other below that. Having another look, we can also see that, you know, 1 in 5 registered aircraft and 1 in 4 registered aeroplanes is actually a Cessna aircraft in Australia. So that's quite a significant percentage. And when we see Cessna start to feature later on in some of our analytics, I guess it's important to keep that context in mind. Pipers also feature fairly prominently. Around 1 in 10 registered aircraft is a Piper aircraft in Australia. If we look over at the helicopter side of the equation, 1 in 2 registered helicopters in Australia, or just over 1 in 2 actually, is actually a Robinson helicopter. So I'm often asked questions around Robinsons, and certainly the amount of time they're seen in the media when it comes to accidents or serious incidents. And I do regularly have to remind people within the organisation, within our board and within industry, that actually there's more registered Robinson helicopters in Australia than all other types of helicopters combined. So it's quite a significant proportion in that. Looking within that as well, around those helicopters on rough numbers are R22s. And then around 45% R44s, with only about just over 5% in the R66 space. So the vast majority of those R22s and 44s that we're seeing there. Broken down a bit of a different way, now looking at flight hours. So this is relying on BITRA data, and it's looking at 2022's flight hours that BITRA publishes annually through and available through their website. Just slightly under half of the flight hours in Australia in 2022 were in commercial air transport. That includes scheduled and non-scheduled, and just under a quarter is in the non-commercial aviation space, and 17% within aero work, 10% instructional flying. So you can see that breakdown. Within commercial air transport, around 2/3 of the commercial air transport activity was in scheduled, and around 1/3 in the non-scheduled space. Looking at it by manufacturer, you can see we have, I guess, what we'd say is a big 4 in regards to activity, and this is again flight hours activity within Australia. So Boeing, Cessna, and Airbus making up a little over half of the flight hours in the country. So it was around 20% Boeing, 16% Cessna, 10% Robinson, and 10% Airbus. Everything else, and by no means is the list limited to just the icons that are there on the screen, but essentially everything else makes up more or less that other half in that regard. So again, that's just around setting the scene and providing some context around where is the industry at and what are we actually doing. So then just as a bit of an overview for what we do from a CASA perspective, and it does set the scene, I guess, to a little bit what we're looking at today. We contribute to the development of what's called the National Aviation Safety Plan. For those who haven't seen that, there is a QR code there in the top right that can take you to that, and I encourage everyone to have a look at that national plan and to get a bit of an understanding of what's in there. The plan itself was first published, the version you can see there on the screen, first published 2021, so just in the sort of COVID period. It was planned before COVID. But the plan itself includes a series of safety performance indicators and then safety performance targets associated with those indicators. So for anyone that's running a safety management system at their airline, I'm sure you'll be familiar with what a safety performance indicator and a target is, but it's essentially about what is the safety performance that we're aiming for. And in this case, it's from the state's perspective. What is the safety performance that the state's aiming for? So within CASA, we track these metrics routinely through our aviation safety scorecard that gets reported up through our safety committee that we have, as well as onto our board and some other forum as well. I guess one of the things to call out more recently, though, is we've actually shifted over. So we've just released in the last month or so, we've released the 2024 to 2027 National Aviation Safety Plan. And again, that has a new set of metrics, not completely new by any means, but it's an evolution rather than a revolution in terms of what we're looking at from indicators and targets. Now, I'll just call out that what's on the screen there is just a sample, I guess, of those. There's a whole series of metrics within that plan, and again, can be useful in terms of getting an understanding from a state perspective and help organisations in what the sort of things they might be keen to monitor within their own safety performance, noting that obviously organisational versus state metrics will definitely be different in that regard. So with that in mind, I guess looking at what we look at from a scorecard perspective, and again, this is just providing a bit of context in terms of what we track routinely through an old scorecard. I'm then going to sort of transition that into show you the new scorecard, and then we'll look at more broadly what we're discussing today from a safety trend perspective. So ultimately, in the previous version of the NASP, we had three broad sectors that we monitored. It was commercial air transport, non-commercial air transport, which essentially was everything else, and then it's the uncrewed, so the remotely piloted aircraft systems. You can see there we have tracking that tells us if we're above minimum performance, above a target performance that we set, above a minimum performance, or below that minimum performance. One of the key changes when it comes to the new scorecard and I guess the new NASP is the new NASP has essentially brought in a new category or new sector that we're actually monitoring and tracking in that space, and that's commercial aviation. So commercial air transport remains unchanged. It's still our scheduled and non-scheduled commercial air transport activities. That includes passenger freight as well as medical transport, air transport. Commercial aviation, however, is now the aerial work and instructional flying aspect of aviation. So it's the aviation that's being done essentially for profit and broadly aligns to those aerial work and instructional flying activity. And we'll see some of our analysis broken down into those sort of focus areas as we move through this afternoon. There's still then the non-commercial aviation side, and again, that's everything other than what's in the commercial air transport and commercial aviation space, particularly in regard, well, obviously noting that that's the crewed side, and then the uncrewed side is on the other, is the final metric or the final sector there that we've broadly grouped. And you'll see, for those that have had a look at the NASP, you see there the broad groupings that we've been consistent with. So again, the short-term view, I guess, is what we're seeing here, where we've got the greens and the reds. It's based on that short-term view, I guess, that we're tracking routinely every other month, essentially, through our scorecard. From a longer-term perspective, though, and this is what we're looking at today a bit more closely, is around the longer-term trends. So looking over those 10-year periods, the 2014 through to present period, what are those trends that we're seeing? And again, we've flagged the colours in here where we've got steady or an improving trend, a worsening trend being the amber, and then a significantly worsening trend being the red. And I guess this is sort of the crux of what we're going to discuss for the next sort of half an hour or so today, is really take you through some of these aspects and some of the highlights that we're seeing. We don't necessarily have all the answers, I guess, in terms of what's causing a lot of these things, but I guess we are taking action based on some of them in terms of where we're seeing particular issues that are emerging. One of the other things I'll call out, and I guess on the previous slide there, that you saw there's quite a lot of grey compared to here. We have the grey because from a short-term tracking perspective, BITRA only publish movement rate for commercial air transport. The actual movement rate published for commercial aviation, non-commercial, is actually not done until quite some time after the new year. So we've just literally in the last month or so had the 2023 numbers published. So that's not something we can sort of rely on to create a rate in the short term. But where we can, which is in commercial air transport, we always look to monitor that rate. In the example of long-term trending, we've actually done both. So we've done a count and a rate across both, and that's what we'll dive into. So we'll actually jump in now, and my intent is to go through particularly some of these amber areas and just have a look at the sort of some of the analytics that we have underpinning it, and just give you a bit of a view of that. We'll probably get through the fatal accidents, the uncrewed, and maybe some of the serious incidents. We may not get through all of it. As I said, there is quite a bit here, but it's just trying to get some of those key messages across. So if I dive into the fatal accident, in the first instance, now this is fatal accidents within commercial air transport that we're initially looking at. As you'd imagine, they are fairly low in terms of numbers. And if we have a look and go through looking at the accounts initially, those counts mostly ones and zeros, which is obviously good from a regulatory perspective when it comes to commercial air transport. It's one of the areas we're primarily focused on. However, there was 2017 and 2022 where there was increased numbers there, 4 in each year. From an overall trend perspective, again, very low numbers, but notionally a bit of a slight trend up in that regard. When we apply that to a rate, again, in this case, with the exception of 2020 and 2021, which obviously were the COVID years, the number of movements in air transport isn't significantly changing. There is a sort of an ongoing underlying growth for the most part, with the exception of those 2 years particularly. However, because those 2 years had zero fatalities or zero fatal accidents, it doesn't necessarily reflect here. But from a rate perspective, I guess what we can see is the number of fatal accidents is essentially mirrored from a count and a rate perspective. Again, because there's not significant movement in the number of movements, or not significant changes, sorry, in the number of movements, it doesn't necessarily have a huge impact from a rate perspective either. And similarly to the count, the rate is slightly trending up there. So you can see that dashed line there from 2022 through 2023 and 2024 from a rate perspective. Just recapping what I said at the start there. So from a BITRA perspective, those movement numbers are only published sort of quite late in the year. We just recently had the 2023 numbers published, but they weren't included in this report. It's happened since we've finished this analysis task. If I keep running through this, I guess the next thing interested to understand from our perspective is, well, what sort of commercial air transport activities are we seeing these particular fatal accidents in? And you can see the red there is passenger transport charters, and we can see most of them are happening in that sort of space, with a few in the Joy Flight sightseeing charter space, and then one in the non-scheduled freight only area as well. If I jump in as well, there's a few other bits of supporting analysis that we can go through. From a fatalities perspective, again, commercial air transport, as would make sense to people, the number of fatalities can often be relatively high, whereas in commercial aviation, typically it's sort of ones and twos that might be involved. In commercial air transport, it's typically higher numbers, and you can see that reflected, I guess, 2017 and 2022, where we had the 4 in each year, is reflected in a greater number of fatalities in each year, and an overall trending up in that sense as well. So diving into it a bit more, and how we break it down, just over 2/3 of those fatal accidents in commercial air transport over the period were in fixed-wing aircraft, and just under 1/3 in helicopters. Again, we dive into the manufacturers and we start looking that, again, Cessna features fairly prominently. As I said back at the start, in the contextual space though, I mean, 1 in 5 registered aircraft in Australia are Cessnas, so higher numbers are not necessarily surprising in that regard. The types of aircraft there, looking at the breakdown, and again, what we're trying to do when we do this is we're looking for the systemic, noting that ATSB, do a very vigorous job of investigating particularly all of these accidents, as they do for a lot of the fatal accidents across commercial air transport and commercial aviation as well. What we're trying to identify is anything systemic, anything that, at face value for a single accident may not be readily identifiable. We're trying to look at across the board. But what we see here is quite a different variety of different aircraft that are involved. Interestingly enough, EC30 was featured twice, which was a bit of a surprise. But again, looking at the details of that, they were both very different types of accidents. One was a VFR into IMC event down in Victoria, and the other was the mid-air collision up here in Queensland on the Gold Coast. So again, different types of events. Just I guess a bit of a reminder there for people that may not be as knowledgeable from an aviation perspective. Some of these companies do evolve over time, and Eurocopter and Airbus helicopters, essentially just as a bit of a rebrand, and the same as Raytheon and Beechcraft. Again, we had name changes and ownership changes over the period and over the year. So where are these happening? I guess was the other thing we wanted to look at. Well, unfortunately for us in Queensland, over half of the fatal accidents in commercial air transport happened in Queensland over that period. And you can see the sort of others broken across the other states, although none in South Australia or Tasmania. Just as a bit of a heads up there in terms of what was happening where, so different types. I won't read through all of those, but just for people to be aware. The one thing that did stand out to a degree is obviously there's quite a few happening up in the top end of Australia, in that Northern Australia area where there's not necessarily a huge population, and quite a few of those, including the 2017 210 in Darwin, the 2022 210 in the NT, the 404 in far north Queensland, and the R44 in far north Queensland, all had an element of weather, I guess, involved or potentially involved in the accident as well. And so again, that was one where there was a bit of a theme that emerged in that sense. Now, from a CASA perspective, we do regularly do a lot of engagement and workshops around the NT and the top end Cairns as well, where we do flying in the wet season and things like that. Those webinars and those activities are really probably focused mostly on this sort of end of the market, the potentially lower end of that commercial air transport market where there's smaller aircraft flying in these areas. So again, that's a shout out that I'll make to encourage anyone sort of in that space to encourage their workforce, their pilots, to get engaged in those sorts of things as they happen. There's a few more steps of analysis here that we have as well. I'll talk to these in general terms, and then if have specific questions, we can certainly discuss a little bit more at the end. You can see here the numbers straight away aren't necessarily adding up to the dozen or so that we'd seen before. Ultimately, the ATSB assign occurrence types to each, or occurrence types to each occurrence, and they have essentially three levels. They have 1, 2, and 3, very creatively named, and you can see within that essentially we're looking then at the different categories, trying to identify trends or themes, trying to see what actually happens in regard to that. So you can see in this space, most of what's happening in this is in regards to this is in operational space, with far less from a technical and an airspace or environmental perspective. So the vast majority are in that operational space. If we then dive down into the second level, we can see another bit of a breakdown here. Terrain collisions is probably one of those categories that isn't particularly helpful to us from a data analysis perspective, because certainly when we have a fatal accident, inevitably there is a terrain collision involved in that. It may not be the primary thing that happened, it may be a consequential, but fairly certainly most fatal accidents are obviously going to hit the ground at some point. So that one is less pertinent to us, and I guess that's where we start focusing on the other stuff, on the fire, smoke and fumes, the aircraft separation, and trying to understand those a little better as we dive in from an analysis perspective. Again, because we are talking really quite low numbers in this space, there isn't a lot from a systemic perspective that we're actually able to identify within this data, which is a positive from our perspective, certainly. Again, down into level 3, so looking again for those other things, the loss of control in flight obviously features quite prominently, as does collision. That said, from a collision perspective, there's several of those. Obviously, there was one of those, that involved 2 aircraft, so there's sort of a bit of a double count there when it comes to the SeaWorld one as an example. And loss of control, again, when we looked into these a bit deeper, that they're quite different in what a lot of them are. So there's some in there that are VFR into IMC type examples. There's other where there's a loss of control on landing on a pontoon out on the Great Barrier Reef, for example. And then there's others that still fall into this category, which might involve in-flight breakups and things like that. Also, the fumes events, again, there was 2 there looking into that, but again, quite different events. So one was actually as a result of as an in-flight fire, and the other was as a result of carbon monoxide. Again, very different aircraft types, very different types there that we're seeing. So if I shoot back then to our main scorecard, it's probably taken us through the commercial air transport side. As we go then into the next one, we'll have a look at commercial aviation. So again, in this space, it was a little split between a worsening trend when it came to account, but when we applied a rate to that, it was actually a steady or an improving trend. So we can have a little further look in there just to see what's happening in that space. So Commercial aviation, you can see a higher number of fatal accidents across the board, which again probably doesn't surprise a lot of people on this call. If we have a look from a rate perspective, again, a fairly steady rate, maybe a very slight increase there, but more or less fairly steady over the period, with definitely higher ones across 2015, 16, and 17. Sorry, that was from a count perspective. If I overlay that with a rate, then again, looking at the rate, it's actually a slightly decreasing trend in the rate. Noting that we don't have the firm data for 2023 at the time of this analysis, nor 2024. There may be a bit of a might change slightly, certainly looking at the 2024 year-to-date data in that regard. So again, well, where is this happening? So looking at this, there's as I mentioned earlier, there's two broad activities that make up commercial aviation, that being aerial work and instructional flying. And we can see that the split there, the red being aerial work and green being instructional flying. So we can see fairly prominent there for the aerial work space. And again, if we drill down another layer into that and say, okay, well, what sort of aerial work are we looking at? We can see one of those lead drivers there is in the agricultural space. So agriculture obviously consists of aerial spreading, spraying, as well as aerial mustering, and there's another, the general sort of other aerial work, agricultural aerial work category. But we can see they certainly form up quite a number across the board there. We have done a bit of work in that space as well, and again, in response to the trends and things that we see in our routine monitoring and the scorecard, we'll often do deeper analysis into particular topics. One of the things that we did in response to a bit of an increase recently was around fatal accident demographics. So there's a few statements, I guess, that were pulled out of that report there in terms of age groups and I guess demographics when it comes to fatal accidents. I won't go into huge detail on all that, but I guess one of the call-outs, or a couple of the call-outs I'll make, is obviously helicopters twice as likely to be involved in a fatal accident than an airplane, and that's again standardised against the number of registered aircraft that we have in country. And I guess the bottom right one, there's another call out that 40% of fatal flying for work accidents, and I'll say flying for work is a broad term that we're sort of using there to apply to any commercial air transport and any commercial aviation activity. 40% of those were associated with agricultural farming flying. So we've done a few things in response to that, not least of which this week we've actually conducted a sector safety risk profile activity. So we've actually got members of industry into the room. People on the call may have been involved in previous ones of those, and we've actually started talking through some of those issues and I guess trying to get some qualitative information from the SMEs within the industry as to where they see those issues and trends sitting. A couple other things I guess to call out in here. This is us looking against the number of fatal accidents versus the number of registered aircraft. And again, the red line doesn't necessarily represent a good or a bad line, but it just represents the average from the sort of top 20 or 30 that we pulled out there. And again, there's also the factor here that not all of these registered aircraft may necessarily be operational. They may just be on the aircraft register and not have been withdrawn. However, there's a couple of standouts. I guess the R22 is quite a significant standout where the number of fatal accidents proportionally to the number of registered aircraft is actually quite high. It's quite above that line, essentially, if we look at the line as the sort of the norm or the average line. And then a few others, I guess, the air tractor, the PA25, the RV6, again, some of which were involved in aerial work there as well. That again, while the numbers of fatal accidents aren't necessarily significantly high, they are proportionally a bit higher than where the other types of aircraft are sitting at. So if I run through the further analysis there, so similar sort of breakdown, I guess, or similar sort of things that we're looking at that we looked at in the previous one. And we got fatal accidents breakdown, so we can see quite a significant proportion in this space in the Robinson and the Cessna space. And again, this is, we looked at the data at the start. They're two of the big four in terms of hours. They represent a significant proportion of our registered aircraft as well. So again, not necessarily surprising to see these on the list. And the other factor, I guess, is that the type of activity that's being done with these aircraft as well is obviously, particularly prominent for aerial mustering, spreading, spraying, for the air tractors as well in that space. So looking across 22s and 44s, there is a bit of an even split. Again, a bit of a split. The 172 being one of the more common Cessnas, also features more prominently when it comes to fatal accidents in this commercial aviation space. And noting that, that's not the only fatal accidents involved in 172, but it is the ones linked to commercial aviation, so linked to that aerial work or instructional flying activity. And then lesser numbers, I guess, there of the others as well. Again, just to call out there of a company merger. So the AS350 there, albeit tagged to different manufacturers, is actually the same aircraft type there. So again, just a bit of a call out there to some work that was done in the past around Robinson helicopters. I'll touch on this really briefly, but it's really to go so far as to, we had a lot of questions asked of us some time ago around, well, why is it that we see so many Robinson helicopters involved in fatal accidents? And I guess ultimately, when we crunch through the analysis, they're actually not really that much overrepresented for the amount of aircraft that they have. And again, this is broadly across all fatal accidents. This is now not specific to commercial aviation. But looking at the whole picture, around 53% of fatal helicopter accidents involved a Robinson helicopter, and they represent around 52% of the registered helicopters. So again, not necessarily significantly disproportionate in that sense as well. That said, they certainly are above some other aircraft types when you look at occurrences and accident rates. And there's a few other stats there around where they're happening. 60% of the R22s in aerial work or instructional flying, which is often quite a bit of time. Carrying on through here, and again looking at where this is happening, and again we find Queensland here is, I guess, punching above its weight, unfortunately, when it comes to these fatal accidents in commercial aviation as well, representing about 33% of the fatal accidents for the country. New South Wales relatively high as well at 29%, and a bit of a split then across the other states. I don't have the next level of breakdown because obviously the number of accidents involved sort of meant that the map would have got far too busy far quickly in terms of what was happening where. But obviously quite a bit of the spreading, spraying and the musterings there across, well, spreading, spraying, New South Wales, Queensland, and the musterings for Queensland, Northern Territory in that sense as well. One thing I will call out, I guess, is I know engagement recently with the WHS WorkSafe Queensland, and they were sort of commenting that in the agricultural space, I think they represent around 3% of the jobs in Queensland. So 3% of employed people in Queensland are working in agriculture, but unfortunately they make up around 30% of the fatalities. So again, from an aviation perspective, it's not necessarily inconsistent with that. Not that it's a good thing by any means from either our sides. And we are exploring ways how we could work better with the state WHS agencies. We've also recently engaged with Farm Safe Australia, as well as the Northern Territories Cattlemen Association, as well as our ongoing association with 4As, which is the Aerial Application of Australia. I've missed an A there, but that entity as well. So again, we are actively working to try and understand and improve how we can actually engage with people in these sectors, and how we can improve getting our safety messaging across in that space. Where's it happening? Again, activity type, bit of a breakdown here. We can see mustering and spreading and spraying, as well as agriculture, makes up around 47% of the fatals in commercial air transport. And then from an instructional flying perspective, that makes up around 32%. So as I've said, we are doing quite a bit of work in that aerial agricultural space in terms of engagement. Also doing work with instructional flying. And we actually have a campaign surveillance which is commencing in the coming weeks, which is targeting flying schools basically, and part of that is as a result of some of this analysis work that's been done. So trying to go out there and understand the rates of compliance and where those particular issues may be. So I think I've got about 10 minutes or so before I wanted to sort of break and allow questions. I know there has been some questions in the chat that Wayne and Sophie have been answering for me, which is fantastic. I guess the other thing I wanted to call out was from an uncrewed perspective in the RPAS space. Obviously, we can see the two reds that are shining out here. So keen to explore that a little bit in terms of looking at the number of accidents. Now, there is a bit of context to call out here, I guess. So here's a number of accidents over the period. It has grown quite significantly 2014 through 2022, although there has been a subsequent drop-off. Obviously, in that time as well, we have seen quite a significant growth in the amount of RPAS utilised within industry. And so, again, it doesn't come as a huge shock that there's an increase in the number of accidents associated with those activities as well. What I will call out here, though, is obviously we're relying on ATSB data for this. So when you think as to, well, who is it that's reporting their accidents to the ATSB when it comes to RPAS operations, it is only the commercial operators. So there's no obligation for, for my 13, now 14-year-old son who flies a drone, if he flies that into a tree at the park and breaks it, there's no obligation on him to report that to ATSB, and we don't actually have any visibility of that. And to be fair, it's probably not something that we really need to have visibility of. So I guess that's an important thing to note. As we look at this, we have applied a bit of a rate where we can. So commercial drone registration came into effect in 2020, partway through 2020. And we got a full year data set there from 2021. And so again, what we've tried to do there is apply a bit of a rate per 1,000 registered drones. And again, the registered drones are those commercial drones. And you can see that that rate has dropped off with the drop off, as you'd expect with that sort of significant drop off in the number of accidents that drones have had here. What are we doing in this space? Well, I guess there's probably one big call out I'll make as to, that stands out to people as to, well, why was there such a significant drop off in 2023 in drone accidents? At the start of January 2023 was when the new TSI, Transport Safety Investigation Regulations, which the ATSB coordinate and own, it was when those new requirements came in. So prior to that, reporting accidents as well as serious incidents and occurrences for drones was essentially relying on the fixed wing, or the crewed aircraft requirements that existed within those regulations. And so for the drone operators, a lot of it wasn't necessarily fit for purpose. There's maybe some debate whether it still is fit for purpose or not, but at the time it certainly wasn't, which meant that I guess it was left open to interpretation, and we got quite a large number of reporting, which certainly isn't a bad thing. But in 2023, they really clarified what it was that needed to be reported to the ATSB by drone operators and who actually needed to report that. And so what that actually meant was that for most, and again, we're only talking commercial drones here because there's no obligation on the recreational drone users, but for most commercial drones, so for those that weigh between 250 grams and 25 kilos, the only things that need to be reported are essentially if you have an accident that destroys the drone, that you have serious property damage, or if you have a loss of separation with a crewed aircraft. They're actually the only three things that need to be reported to the ATSB. So that actually, clearly defined what was needed, and as a result, I think that's that drop off that we've seen. For drones that are above 25 kilos, they also, in addition to reporting accidents, which was those three criteria I mentioned before, they also have an obligation to report serious incidents. And there's a sort of a further list of define what is a serious incident within for a drone within those regulations. However, again, an important thing to note there is out of the 33,000 registered drones that we have in Australia, only around just under 500 are actually above 25 kilos. So only about 1.5% of drones would actually need to report anything other than an accident in that sense. So again, that provides a little context there. It also shows, when we go back in a moment, why the occurrence rate is also red, as with the accident rate. I probably won't dive into those slides today, but essentially that is because any occurrence that's being reported essentially is an accident. we're not really capturing anything below that. Whereas in the crewed aircraft space, depending on the type of sector and the type of operation you're doing, we're capturing far more below just the accident space. A couple of other call outs there in terms of what we're doing. In 2020, the National Drone Detection System was introduced, and that gives us the ability to track and monitor drones in and around the controlled aerodromes in Australia. And then since that time, we've sort of evolved and matured the reporting and the data analysis that we're able to do through that, including incorporating some of that into our routine scorecard reporting. More recently, we've done quite a significant piece of work in and around Sydney, looking at the recreational RPAS usage and looking for basically near misses, if there has been any, with crewed aircraft in the vicinity of Sydney International. I won't dive into that analysis now, but that is something that we're looking to perhaps brief maybe in a similar forum to this early in the new year, so people get an appreciation and understanding of that. So again, I won't dive into the occurrence rate there for the uncrewed, the other red, again, because it just really mirrors that accident rate, because there's not a lot else left to report. The last one I might try and get through just in the last couple of minutes before I pause for questions is serious incidents in the commercial air transport space. And this is one that we have been tracking for some time, and even on the shorter term scorecard, we've been seeing increases. It doesn't reflect as much here in the long term. It's only a relatively minor increase over the period. When we look at a rate, we apply that though, we can see the rate is a bit more of a significant increase. Not massively, but again, just increasing, which this is an area that we continue to be focused on as to, well, why are those serious incidents increasing? And obviously, certainly in that more recent period, it's been happening as well. So one thing we did do though is we took the opportunity here to sort of merge our accident and serious incident data, because if you recall on that previous slide, accidents were sort of green across the board, and we thought, okay, it's interesting that we're not seeing an increase in accidents, but we are seeing an increase in serious incidents. When we sort of merge those two things together, we can see the serious incidents in the blue there and the accidents in the red. We start to get a bit of a different picture, I guess, where that's actually decreasing both from a count and from a rate perspective. And again, this is something that we're still pondering, I guess. I mean, there's two lines of thought that we could take with this. One is that, you know, things that were perhaps more likely to be an accident in the past are now being caught by some sort of control, be that a system control, aircraft control procedure, whatever it might be, and are resulting in a lesser consequence, i.e. it's now only a serious incident, not an accident, which is a positive, I guess, that the number of accidents are falling and the number of serious incidents is increasing. Conversely, though, you know, if we take the serious incidents as potential precursors to accidents and then to fatal accidents, then it is a concern that those are increasing, which is again why I guess we do further analysis into those. I go through this rather briefly. I don't know, I've only got a minute or two left before I wanted to sort of pause for questions. We can see, you know, from those serious incidents in commercial air transport, the two things that are really driving it, from a level 1 occurrence type, remembering that this is how ATSB classify their occurrences, is in the operational and in the airspace areas. So if I dive into them briefly, in the operational space, again, going to that next tier, so looking at what are the type 2 occurrences that are happening, we can see quite a few, including quite a few areas with adverse trends. And again, this is part of the areas we're continuing to do work on at the moment. And that includes things like we're in the process of shortly be putting out an aircraft equipment survey to all aircraft operators in an attempt to sort of glean what sort of equipage the fleets are equipped with. Obviously, we know what the regulatory minimum standard is when it comes to things like VHF radios, when it comes to things like ADS-B out and transponders. What we're trying to understand though is what the actual equipage rate is. You know, so ADS-B in, for example, is actually not mandated really for anyone, but we're keen to understand, well, what proportion of aircraft are actually using ADS-B in. So it's one of the things that we're doing in response to some of these. Again, I won't go into all of this too much. We are seeing ongoing issues, I guess, and we're having discussions with some of the major airlines around some of those issues, around operations in and around non-controlled aerodromes for air transport aircraft, and interacting with other sectors, you know, such as instructional flying and GA in general. And again, that's part of the ongoing work. Within that space as well, there is a a national working group that's been established under the Department of Infrastructure around ADSB particularly, and that's in response to one of the items within the aviation white paper that's called for a strategy around how we utilise ADSB in Australia. So that's part of what we're looking at as well. You can see a couple of others I won't dive into, but a few other trend analysis activities that we're undertaking, deep dives, I guess, into response to these more broader issues. Again, if I have a quick just glance at the airspace issues there, you can see the vast majority, no real surprise, are in aircraft separation. That said, the majority of those aircraft separation occurrences are also in Class G. So we are doing quite a bit of work ongoing around that Class G. Part of that is the equipment survey I've mentioned, and we do continue to engage with some of the major airlines on what can be done, both at an operational and a regulatory level to help address some of those things. And again, there's a few examples there of some of the ongoing work that we've done. So that's probably the main things that I wanted to call out today. I might pause there. I know it's just after 1:15. I know we have had quite a few questions in the chat, but I just want to give the opportunity for anyone that either still has an outstanding question in the chat or anyone that may have a question they'd like to ask, and I can do my best to answer that. Chris.
Yeah, just in the context of safety 1, safety 2, we're obviously looking at a lot of data stuff here, what's gone wrong. How do we look forward to what are we doing right? Do we have another set of pictures here that can show us what is working in the industry to improve these rates?
Yeah, I guess as a safety regulator, that's one of our challenges. I mean, obviously you can see we're dealing with a lot of data, but the data we deal with tends to be the what's gone wrong data for the most part. In my experience, having worked in 121 Airlines and talking to people more recently, probably only 2, maybe 3 or 4% of what gets reported to an airline's SMS actually makes its way to ATSB, which then means that we have visibility of it. So I guess even within the what went wrong space, we're only seeing a very small subset of that. We have concepts, I guess, that we're currently trying to flesh out as a regulator, and we'll be working with the industry to do that on what other sources of data might be available to us, and how we could better share data as an industry, across the different sectors and across industry more broadly. And I think that will perhaps help in some of that aspect. But at the moment, I guess we're very much limited in the data sets that we have available to us, and that lends itself to the more reactive aspect of trend monitoring.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Any other questions? I can see a couple of questions there in the chat. Does CASA conduct assurance activities regarding self-reporting of reportable serious incidents? From Steve. I guess if CASA knows that something's happened and it isn't reported, then we'd certainly be looking to engage with an operator in that regard. I guess through ongoing SMS surveillance, that would also lend itself to an opportunity to make sure things are being reported. But ultimately, certainly in the occurrence, I guess, and even the serious incident space, we rely on that just culture, I guess, within the airlines, and we rely on the airlines then applying those for the crews within the airlines to actually report that through, and then for the airlines to have the same sort of approach where they're reporting that to ATSB and being open and honest in that regard. Obviously, the requirements to put these reports in are a requirement that doesn't sit within CASA's remit. It's not within our regulatory acts or our regulations to actually around these safety incidents reporting. That's an ATSB requirement. So the challenge, I guess, is who can try and enforce that, or should be an enforcement, or is it an encouragement? The reality is it's really an encouragement aspect that we need to probably focus on. And part of that is, I guess, building the picture and building the understanding from an industry perspective through events like this to make sure that we're able to share the data and share our findings. Couple of questions there I can see again, and I apologise if I'm missing them. They are just popping up here as I'm talking. Will the presentation be available on the CASA website? We will make a recording available, so this session has been recorded. For those that came on late, they may have missed that at the start. We have recorded this session, and this session will be available through the website onto the CASA YouTube page as well. The actual presentation itself, we may not, and that's not because we don't want to share anything. It's more just it's a bit nuanced in terms of how it functions. It's not something we can share easily in PDF. You may have noticed layers and things like that within slides as we went through. It doesn't lend itself, unfortunately, to being PDF'd and presented in that way. But I'm also, if I've missed something today, and people are welcome to sort of drop me an email, mark.roberts4. There are only 2 of us in CASA, but for some reason I got number 4 at casa.gov.au as my email address. Reece, benchmarking, yes. I guess benchmark is something that we try and do, certainly. I think more and more states are embracing the National Aviation Safety Plan concept and putting those SPIs and SPTs in place, which should support us then in being able to actually track and monitor. For those that are aware and those that noticed, we've tried to standardise as much as we can with the Global Aviation Safety Plan, which then means as other states do the same, we'll be able to actually compare like for like across that. And that comes down to even the sort of rates that we're monitoring is trying to be standardised against that global context. Part of what we're doing is also, I think we've got a safety management panel meeting at ICAO next month, and we'll be presenting the sort of concept as to how CASA monitors and tracks our NAS performance and our metrics as well, again, to try and sort of get other states thinking along the same sort of lines. I've got a hand up. I can't see who it is. It's Mike.
G'day, thanks very much for the presentation firstly, and sorry I did come on late, so apologies if you've answered this, but access to either through CASA or ATSB to some of the consolidated data. ATSB sort of does limit industry access to database information you can only download in portions. Is there a mechanism that the industry can access consolidated databases on the information that you've just presented for us to interrogate ourselves, obviously desensitized?
Yeah, that's a good question, and unfortunately, I'm going to give one of those annoying, government answers that ATSB obviously manage that data set. It is we meet with ATSB on a regular basis, so that's something that I can flag, and I'm sure my team's listening now. We can flag to ask that question because I know we have access to different data sets, but in previous life I've experienced the same challenge. So for those that aren't aware, ADSB does have a very good Power BI function. So there is a website available that you can go to, and essentially everything we've spoken about today when it comes to the incidents, not necessarily the movements, but would be available through there. I guess the challenge that I think Mike's referring to is the ability to actually download that to then make your own sort of independent use of that data. That's something that I can certainly flag with the ATSB. It's also something from a longer term perspective, as I sort of alluded to a few moments ago, we are looking for how better can we share data as an industry, and that includes us, it includes ATSB as well. And I think that data set would be an obvious one to first cab off the rank in that regard to make that easier. But as it stands now, unfortunately, no. But I'll definitely raise that with the ATSB, Mike.
That'd be great, thanks. Yeah, I don't think it's a privacy or anything concern, given that you can access it, you can download it, but just in portions. So it limits our ability to use that information to assess risks, see where our potential higher risk areas are.
Yeah, definitely. I noticed there's been a few questions in the chat there around recreational aircraft versus VH Reg. So I guess what we've got in here, the pack that we looked at, and I know we didn't really get down into the non-commercial space. Today's sort of session was probably a bit more targeted at the commercial air transport and the commercial aviation sort of end of town. The fatal accidents, I guess, in the non-commercial aviation space would have included recreational Australia aircraft. RAOs registered aircraft and other sports aviation aircraft in that sense. Obviously the registered aircraft that we gave contextually at the start would not have done because they're not VH registered aircraft, but certainly the fatalities, so the trends that we saw and the fact, I guess, that they didn't feature as amber or red means that those trends over that 10-year period are actually trending down in that space. I hope that answers some of those questions. There was a hand, but it looks like it might have disappeared. Thanks to Deborah, who's put that link in the chat there for people to access in that regard. Benjamin. Have I got you, Benjamin?
Sorry.
You're coming through somewhat broken.
Okay, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, got you now. Got
yeah,
you now.
sorry. Sorry if this is not part of the scope, but I'm just wondering if you've got any update on when Part 5 may be released by CASA.
Yeah, I don't have a hard and fast timeline for that. I know it is.
Yep.
We've recently been asked to, as an organisation, look at our forward regulatory program and really try and define what work needs to be and will be on that. Consolidation of SMS regs, for those that aren't aware, that's essentially what Part 5 is on that list. The challenge that we have, I guess, in that space, and you know, Benjamin, I've been at CASA around 6 years. When I was in industry before that as a safety manager, I was waiting for Part 5 at that time as well. So I understand the frustration and I understand the challenges that having multiple sets of SMS regs can cause. The challenge is we are limited by the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, which again is one of those annoying bureaucratic answers, whereby we don't actually write the regulations. So CASA Part 5 really as a regulation is not really a hard regulation to write. Most of the guidance is really available and it's a matter of a lot of consolidation. Our challenge, I guess, is there are other more pressing matters that need to be addressed, noting that Part 5 is probably more of a consolidation than a new reg. You know, it's not really greenfields bringing in new concepts. So there are, prioritise-wise, there are things that we have high priorities on, and then capacity in terms of throughput, in terms of actually getting the people that write the regs outside of CASA is also a challenge. I know that doesn't give you a hard and fast answer. I know the team that are overseeing it have started work again on it recently. It had been on pause for some time. So I can only say that hopefully it is edging towards happening.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
All right, any other questions anyone wants to call out? Question there, what is the main cause for accident incidents related to instructional flying, which will trigger the CASA audit? Again, I probably don't have those all the way down to the main causes to hand at that, to be perfectly honest. In terms of the audit, though, I know that we have seen some different intelligence, I guess, including some of our data analysis around accidents and the trends around instructional flying. There's also been some other things that we've seen that have triggered that campaign surveillance. And a campaign surveillance activity is one of those things that CASA is able to do as we see emerging issues. So from it's not solely based on the data analysis that we see, because as I mentioned before, we're only really seeing a small percentage of what's happening out there. But there has been discussions, and I guess we have decided to respond in doing that campaign surveillance activity. And it is one of the I guess, regulatory levers that we have available to us in response to sort of emerging safety trends and safety issues. I don't know if Wayne or Sophie, is there any other questions that are in the chat that I can help out with? There's no one more there. Do I believe CASA's just culture approach is changing over time, and if so, how? Yeah, I guess it's a fairly broad question. I suppose, for everyone that maybe says that it does, and I believe that it is certainly getting more positive over time. I'm sure there's people that have examples as to where they'll tell me that it's not, but I think generally it is. Certainly at the 121 end, I think CASA's more mature SMSs, CASA is more comfortable to allow safety investigations to play out and understand the outcomes of those investigations as opposed to diving in very quickly. I think we take a sort of a risk-based and a sort of a just culture approach to how we apply a lot of things in terms of decision making. I know it is part of our regulatory philosophy as well. But I also acknowledge that if we want to mature and go that step further, certainly when it comes to data sharing across industry, that there is potentially some parts of industry that don't necessarily we don't necessarily have that trust yet, and that we will need to progress and work towards. And that's not dissimilar for those airlines that have implemented an FDAP. It's gaining the trust there of the workforce in terms of how that FDAP is used. I'd envisage a similar sort of process in some parts of industry that would be needed if we start talking about sharing data as to what we're going to share and what we're actually going to do with that data. But again, that's probably in my longer term strategy pocket, and I know, as I said, I'm sort of working on a conceptual framework at the moment, but I guess it'll take some effort and certainly some funding to get that up and running. No more questions necessarily jumping out at me. I will have our team sort of review that chat after the event, and if there's something we've sort of not really got to, I can certainly try and address those and respond to people through their registered email addresses. But otherwise, thanks everyone for their time. We are hoping that perhaps we can do other presentations, perhaps not exactly like this one, but looking at the trends and the outcomes that we've identified, a couple of times a year. So I guess stay tuned for those into 2025. And if anyone has any queries, please feel free to reach out.